They humiliated a bricklayer for not knowing how to read. But when it came time to sign the deeds, they found out who he really was. Welcome to our channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. Once upon a time, there was a humble bricklayer named Stephen who woke up every day before sunrise to head to construction site and earn a living through honest work. From a very young age, he had learned the value of effort and dedication, as he never had the opportunity to finish school and therefore didn't know how to read or write. Despite this shortcoming, Stephen stood out for his meticulous work, building sturdy walls and strong structures that always received praise from even the most experienced architects. Often on site, the foreman would remark that Stephen was one of the company's best bricklayers and that, despite being unable to read blueprints, he intuitively understood how the pieces of a building should fit together. His reputation for having hands of gold gradually spread throughout the region, although in his heart, Stephen always carried the burden of his illiteracy. One day, a young engineer named William arrived at the construction site, ambitious and impatient, whose treatment of the bricklayers under his charge left much to be desired. Without bothering to get to know Stephen, he ridiculed him in front of everyone upon discovering he couldn't read the safety manuals. Stephen felt an indescribable shame because he had never before been so attacked over something he had always considered a simple limitation, not a reason to be mocked. Amid the laughter from some, other workers felt pity seeing how the new engineer publicly belittled a man who had years of experience in the trade. From that moment on, the relationship between Stephen and William became strained, with sarcastic comments and contemptuous orders that turned the work environment hostile. Nevertheless, Stephen remained calm and continued to do his best at every assigned task, aware that his dignity did not depend on the approval of someone so arrogant. One weekend, when the crew was resting, William decided to organize a meeting with all the staff to discuss details about the next phase of the project. At that meeting, important documents were handed out that everyone was supposed to read and sign, which made Stephen very nervous as he tried to hide his anxiety. William, amused, called the bricklayer to the front as if he wanted to expose his inability and give him a public lesson on the importance of literacy. Stephen, his head lowered, heard laughter in the background, but refused to let himself be completely trampled. And without a word, he took the papers, glanced quickly at the printed lines, and then froze. Those present were waiting, eager to see the mockery William would surely unleash. Although many workers intended to defend Stephen, fear of losing their jobs kept them silent. It was at that moment that Stephen, remembering past humiliations, felt a knot in his throat and an urge to run away. But he held back because something inside him told him this was not the moment to give up. Even so, he chose not to argue with William, and with a peaceful attitude, he handed the papers back and signed. The engineer let out a laugh that echoed throughout the room, hurling hurtful remarks about how someone unable to read could ever claim to be useful on the site. Amid looks of compassion and second-hand embarrassment, Stephen walked away in silence, holding back tears that threatened to well up in his tired eyes. That scene marked a turning point for crew, as many co-workers realized that the toxic environment was fueled by William's arrogance and by the passivity of those who were afraid to speak up. Over the following weeks, the hostility worsened to the point where Stephen began spending his breaks away from the rest of the group, seeking refuge at the rear of the construction site to swallow his pain in solitude. At night, he would sit in his humble home, looking at the walls he had built some time ago, thinking of the cruel words the engineer had spoken to him in front of everyone. He often considered quitting, looking for another job, starting from scratch elsewhere, but he needed to support his family and could not afford to be unemployed. His wife, kind and understanding Elena, tried to encourage him by reminding him that the true value of a person was not measured by their academic level, but by the strength of their spirit and the nobility of their heart. Although Stephen was grateful for Elena's words, deep down he felt an open wound that grew bigger every day with William's daily taunts. Gradually, rumors that a bricklayer was being humiliated for not knowing how to read began to spread beyond the site, eventually reaching one of the project's primary investors, a businessman named Don Jose. This gentleman, known for his wisdom and philanthropy, decided to visit the construction site personally to evaluate the work environment. Nobody expected his visit, and when he arrived, everyone became tense because Don Jose was a figure both highly respected and feared. To everyone's surprise, the investor requested to speak individually with each worker, including Stephen and William. These interviews took place in a small makeshift office where Don Jose patiently listened to everyone's stories, complaints, and testimonies. When it was Stephen's turn, the bricklayer entered with lowered eyes, a knot in his throat, certain that nothing would change, but determined to be honest about everything he had experienced. He spoke of his dedication to his job, the humiliation he had endured, and how he yearned to learn to read so he would never again feel inferior to others. Don Jose looked at him with compassionate eyes and, without judging, asked him to share more about his life, his family, and how he had become one of the region's best bricklayers without knowing how to read. Stephen's story moved the investor, who felt great empathy for the man's determination and the noble way he accepted his limitations. Before saying goodbye, Don Jose promised to return in a few days and hinted he would bring a small surprise. Stephen didn't quite understand what he meant, but he felt a ray of hope after seeing the kind gaze of such an important man. Meanwhile, William had no idea what Don Jose was planning and continued with his haughty behavior, unconcerned about any repercussions. Nobody imagined that the real surprise would not only stem from Don Jose's generosity, but also from a twist of fate that would soon completely shake Stephen's life. Without realizing it, the times ahead would forever change the power dynamics on that site, and the signing of certain deeds would reveal a secret no one had ever suspected. Over the days following Don Jose's visit, the atmosphere at the construction site remained tense. Yet Stephen, though still the target of William's malicious remarks, held on to a glimmer of hope. He waited for the small surprise the investor had promised, not allowing himself to get his hopes up too much, because his life had been marked by harsh realities that rarely turned into tangible opportunities. Meanwhile, William boasted about his position as an engineer more than ever and exercised his authority rigidly, looking for any reason to reprimand Stephen and flaunt his supposed power in front of the other workers. Despite everything, Stephen's colleagues began to show solidarity with him, and instead of joining in the mockery, they started to exhibit team spirit. They helped him review the instructions on the blueprints, shared key information about upcoming construction phases, and even offered to take documents home so he could practice reading. Nonetheless, Stephen felt a deep shame whenever he failed to decipher the printed words, aware of the patience and commitment his co-workers were investing in trying to teach him. At night, sitting at the small wooden table in his kitchen, Stephen would look at the papers covered in diagrams and unintelligible letters, try and spot any familiar shape that might help him progress in learning how to read. His wife, Elena, did what she could to guide him with the little knowledge she had acquired in her youth, but she wasn't a teacher and had no proper methods, so the sessions were slow and sometimes frustrating. Stephen felt pangs of discouragement upon seeing how complicated it was to learn to read from scratch as an adult with so many responsibilities. Moreover, after long days of physical labor, he was exhausted, and the letters seemed to dance before his tired eyes. Still, very early one morning, just before leaving for work, Stephen got the news that Don Jose would return that same day to make an important announcement. Excitement grew among the workers because, for many, the investor's presence meant new injections of capital, improvements in working conditions, or even a chance to expand the project. When Don Jose arrived, accompanied by 2 assistants, the first thing he did was ask William to gather everyone in the same room where Stephen had been publicly humiliated a few weeks earlier. The engineer, displeased, had no choice but to comply and quickly assembled the crew, though his gestures and attitude revealed his displeasure at the situation. Once everyone was gathered in the room, Don Jose took the floor and explained that he had listened carefully to the concerns and conflicts at the site. He said he believed it was vital for everyone to have the opportunity to grow and learn, regardless of their circumstances. Then he announced that he would fund a literacy program for anyone who wished to participate, either at the site or elsewhere, at no cost. Upon hearing this, Most of the workers, especially Stephen, couldn't hide their amazement and excitement. For Stephen, it meant the fulfillment of a dream he had considered almost out of reach. William pretended not to care, though deep down he felt uncomfortable because he knew this measure lessened the sting of the humiliation he had inflicted on Stephen with his taunts. But Don Jose's announcements did not end there. With a warm smile, he asked Stephen to step forward, to the astonishment of everyone, including the bricklayer himself. The investor mentioned that during his interview with Stephen, he had noticed the man's dedication and skill, and for that reason, in addition to the literacy program, he wanted to give him an opportunity to improve his financial and family situation. At that moment, Don Jose's two assistants pulled back a cover that was draped over a large blueprint of the project, revealing a new section that was about to begin. In a solemn voice, Don Jose explained that after doing some research into the real skills of each worker, he had decided to offer Stephen a position as site supervisor for this new section, with a higher salary and the possibility of directly overseeing a small group of bricklayers. Stephen's heart pounded as a murmur of astonishment spread through the room. William, on the other hand, felt as if he were losing control because he couldn't fathom a mere bricklayer rising to a higher level of responsibility. Amid the stunned looks from those present, Stephen could only utter a few words of gratitude and humility. Don Jose, giving him a warm pat on the shoulder, said he simply hoped Stephen would use this opportunity to set an example of self-improvement for everyone. For the first time in a long time, Stephen felt his efforts and sacrifices were being acknowledged. Still, the shadow of his inability to read hovered over him, for although he would now earn more, he urgently needed to learn to read and write to handle his new responsibilities. That afternoon, as a cool breeze wafted through the site at lunchtime, many colleagues came up to Stephen to congratulate him and promise their support. Among them were Pedro, an experienced bricklayer in whom Stephen placed complete trust, and Marta, a young architect who approved of promoting someone who truly understood construction from the ground up. William, by contrast, offered only a sour expression before locking himself in his office, claiming he had documents to review. Stephen, however, felt that the hostility no longer affected him as much because he now had Don Jose's backing and a new position that, despite its challenges, allowed him and his family to live more comfortably. That night, as he walked home, Stephen reflected on everything that was happening and couldn't hold back tears of both happiness and uncertainty. He knew the changes would be immense and that he would face big challenges, but for the first time in many years, he no longer felt that his illiteracy was an insurmountable barrier. Instead, he viewed it as a challenge that, with help from Don Jose's program and the support of his colleagues, he might overcome sooner than he had imagined. His joy didn't fade when he got home and told Elena and their young son in detail all that had happened at the site. Elena, her eyes brimming with tears of pride, hugged him and promised to do whatever it took to support him in his new role. Still, both knew the journey would not be easy because managing part of the site meant dealing with blueprints, reports, and documents that required constant reading and signing. That night, Stephen went to bed with a swirling mix of emotions in his heart, trying to picture what his life would be like from then on. He realized he could not waste any more time and would have to enroll in Don Jose's literacy program as soon as possible, feeling that each day was too valuable not to learn something new. His anxiety spurred him to mentally review all the advice his co-workers had given him, doing simple exercises, recognizing letters and syllables, practicing with street signs and food packaging. It all seemed like an unfamiliar world, yet a fascinating one, where every word learned would be a key to opening new doors. Around that time, Stephen began his first informal classes with a volunteer from Don Jose's program, a young college student who offered lessons in exchange for a small stipend for transportation. With great patience, she taught him the vowels, the most frequent consonants, and some tricks for associating letters with sounds. Although Stephen sometimes got frustrated and felt like quitting, the thought of his new supervisor position on the site gave him enough motivation to keep going. The work environment began to change quickly as workers grew more motivated by the chance to learn and improve. The old break and lunch area turned into a makeshift classroom, complete with alphabet posters and exercise notebooks. The days felt lighter, and Stephen's situation was no longer so stigmatized because other co-workers also admitted they had issues with reading and joined classes. Meanwhile, William found himself increasingly isolated. His arrogant demeanor had no place in this environment of teamwork and solidarity. Some of his decisions began to be scrutinized due to Don Jose's increased supervision. The new section of the site for which Stephen was now responsible moved forward at a steady pace, and its rising structures showed the skilled hand of a man who, although not a fluent reader, perfectly understood the secrets of concrete and bricks. Despite this progress, signing the deeds for a new plot of land adjacent to the worksite became the focus of rumors. It was said that these documents were confidential and that, once formalized, they could alter the entire project's direction and potentially its main leadership. No one suspected, however, that the papers would reveal something far more astonishing related to Stephen and his past. As the deed signing date approached, some felt curious, others anxious, while William, in his arrogance, believed that signing those documents would be his chance to demonstrate his absolute superiority over the humble bricklayer. In the weeks leading up to the signing, anticipation built steadily. Some people thought Don Jose would purchase a larger plot to expand the site and create more jobs, while others believed it was a maneuver to sell construction to a more powerful conglomerate, so he could exit the project. In any case, everyone focused on that crucial moment, as the papers involved could completely reshape the scenario. Stephen, immersed in his reading practice and his new responsibilities overseeing the new section, also felt curious about the deed signing, especially because it might involve changes in management and therefore affect his professional future. Each day, he devoted long hours to studying letters with his volunteer literacy teacher, trying to read short paragraphs of simple text and write his first sentences with trembling hand. A few joking co-workers encouraged him by saying that soon he'd be able to read his own employment contract without anyone's help. Meanwhile, William, aware that his authority was waning, pulled whatever strings he could to safeguard his position and stay close to the project's leadership. He made phone calls, sent emails, and presented himself with a servile attitude whenever Don Jose visited the site. Although no one dared tell him openly, most people sensed that the engineer was primarily looking out for his own interests rather than working out of true vocation. On the appointed day, it was announced that the deed signing would take place in a rented conference room a few kilometers from the site. All personnel were invited to watch the proceedings, though only specific staff members had the right to participate directly in the signing. Among them, to everyone's surprise, was Stephen, who appeared on the attendee list with voting rights due to his new supervisory position overseeing a crucial part of the project. When William learned this, he went into a rage, insisting that an illiterate man couldn't represent anything or anyone in such an important event. However, Don Jose insisted on Stephen's presence, explaining that his practical experience was vital for the project's success and that he had tremendous confidence in him. This only heightened tensions between William and Stephen, and when the day of the signing arrived, the atmosphere was charged enough that you could practically feel the electricity in the air. Once everyone was gathered in the conference room, the main table was laid out with folders, seals, and documents. Cameras from the local press were strategically positioned to capture the moment. Several journalists were drawn by the story that a major investor was about to close a multi-million-dollar deal with a group of regional business people. What they still didn't know was that the climax of the story would not revolve solely around numbers and properties, but rather around the identity of a humble bricklayer who, until that moment, was considered a nobody. With a solemn gesture, Don Jose began by thanking those involved and highlighting the work done so far. He spoke about how the project had provided employment for many families and about a commitment to continue improving living conditions for people in the area. After a brief but moving speech, he turned things over to the legal representatives who would explain each clause of the documents. At that point, Stephen became uneasy, certain that the time would come for him to sign and possibly read a paragraph to confirm he understood what he was signing. Stephen's heart pounded as the lawyer's voice filled the room, detailing legal terms and the properties being transferred. Occasionally, he felt William's mocking gaze. The engineer seemed to be eagerly awaiting the moment Stephen would have confessed, in front of everyone, that he couldn't read properly. The bricklayer, who had made some progress in his literacy classes, still felt insecure and feared embarrassing himself before cameras, business people, and colleagues alike. Finally, it came time to read the main section of the documents and have the parties involved sign. The lawyer laid out the paperwork and, with a firm gesture, invited Stephen to step forward. Don Jose observed him calmly, as if confident everything would be fine, while William and other onlookers prepared to witness what they believed would be a shameful outcome. However, something unexpected happened at that very moment. As Stephen approached the table, the lawyer and the notary exchanged puzzled looks while reviewing the documentation. They began asking if anyone in the room knew the history of the family that, according to records, had originally owned the land on which the project now stood. Don Jose, also curious, got up from his seat and went over to examine the papers. The text said that the land in question once belonged to an old local surname whose heirs had never appeared in town and apparently emigrated to another country many years ago. The project had proceeded with the government's approval, assuming that the real owners had relinquished their rights, given there was no proof they still existed. Stephen, unable to fully read the document, didn't understand what was going on, but he noticed Don Jose's face show growing surprise as he pointed to a specific section of the document for the notary. Within seconds, murmurs spread throughout the conference room, and William grew restless, demanding to know what was happening. The notary, speaking cautiously, stepped forward and announced that according to official records, the land where the project stood originally belonged to a man named Stephen Garcia, whose whereabouts were unknown. Everyone fell silent, and Stephen himself turned pale on hearing his full name. He was indeed named Stephen Garcia, but he had never even considered the possibility that his family had roots in that land. He came from a humble background, and his father, also a bricklayer, had never mentioned any property rights. That was when Don Jose, after comparing some of his own documents with the notary's, turned to Stephen and quietly asked if he knew anything about his grandparents or great-grandparents. Nervous and baffled, Stephen explained that his paternal family came from a distant village and that they'd never had clear documentation or records. The notary spoke again, clarifying that there was a total match in names, dates, and family ties. If the connection was confirmed, it meant Stephen was a legitimate heir to all the land on which the project had been built, and thus had primary rights to the business. When those words resonated in the room, the impact was so powerful it seemed to stifle the air. Journalists began snapping pictures and seeking statements, while William stood there stunned, his face blank, not fully grasping the magnitude of what was happening. Stephen felt his legs give way. Don Jose, smiling gently, helped him over to a chair. It seemed that an essential part of the story was suddenly being uncovered, and the normally routine act of signing official documents had turned into something completely extraordinary. Several people from the legal team immediately began cross-checking data, old records, and birth certificates. It quickly became apparent that the project itself stood on land unknowingly owned by Stephen's family for generations. Shock reigned in the conference room, and rumors spread like wildfire. A simple bricklayer, who until recently had been mocked for not knowing how to read, turned out to be legally linked to the most valuable property of the project. In a desperate effort to maintain composure, William approached Don Jose to demand an explanation, claiming it was impossible that someone with such limited resources could be the heir to such coveted land. Don Jose calmly reminded him that the law makes no distinction based on academic background or social status. If the documents confirmed Stephen was a direct successor to the original owners, there was no room for argument. Meanwhile, Stephen remained overwhelmed, unsure how to react to the news. He had barely come to terms with the fact that, according to those papers, he held legitimate rights to the site's land. Around him, journalists fired off questions, cameras flashed in his face, and some co-workers approaching to congratulate him or simply express their surprise. Stephen's hands trembled and his heart beat wildly, for never in his life had he imagined himself in such a situation. The notary, striving to keep order, asked the government officials present to review the genealogical documentation confirming the family connection. A folder was opened, containing copies of old birth records, dusty deeds, and forgotten tax receipts. Slowly, with the help of the company's lawyer and a municipal representative, they pieced together a family tree connecting Stephen to the land in question. Stephen, his voice trembling, shared the little he knew about his grandfather. Family lore said that he had traveled in search of work and settled elsewhere, leaving behind the place where he was born. With each new page the notary read, the surprise intensified. Everything fit together, dates, names, and testimonies of old neighbors, confirming the inheritance that rightfully belonged to the Garcia family. Don Jose, far from looking upset, appeared genuinely excited about the stroke of fortune that had befallen Stephen, though he was also mentally calculating the legal steps necessary to keep from halting the project or jeopardizing his investment. After extensive consultation among the professionals in the room, it became clear that if Stephen wanted, he could immediately claim total ownership of the site and renegotiate all agreements with the investors. The news spread to the city within hours. For the local press, it was a major bombshell. Illiterate Bricklayer turns out to be the real owner of important construction site. So read the headlines that began circulating. Meanwhile, William wavered between disbelief and anger, unable to accept that the man he had once humiliated now held the key to the project's future. In a fit of desperation, he tried to question the legitimacy of the documents, but was quickly silenced by the overwhelming evidence. As for Stephen, he was consumed by mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt an immense sense of relief, knowing the humiliations he had suffered would not continue, and that he suddenly had the means to transform his life and provide for his family. On the other hand, he feared being overwhelmed by the flurry of financial interests that now surrounded his name. He had never managed large sums of money nor interacted with business people or lawyers, and he was afraid of making mistakes that could ruin his good fortune. Seeing his anxiety, Don Jose wisely suggested they take a short break so everyone could process the situation. He invited Stephen to meet with him and a couple legal advisors in a nearby room away from the cameras and curious onlookers. There, in a calmer environment, they tried to explain his options and the potential risks. Stephen realized that if he demanded immediate property rights, he could halt the construction and request compensation. But that would mean the loss of jobs for hundreds of families who depended on the project. Alternatively, he could negotiate to become the majority partner, which would give him a position of power to protect the well-being of the workers, but at the cost of making complex financial and administrative decisions he felt unprepared to handle. Stephen's head spun. The man who, just days before, was struggling to read his first words now had to decide the future of a multimillion-dollar investment. Elena, his wife, encouraged him not to be swayed by greed and to think of the greater good, reminding him that his hard work and unity with others had brought him this far, and that he should avoid becoming arrogant like William. His co-workers were also on edge, for they knew everything depended on the decision the new heir would make. Finally, Stephen closed his eyes for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and spoke from the heart. He had no desire to see anyone lose their job. He didn't want to put so many families out on the street, and he certainly didn't want to become the villain of a story he hadn't even known he was starring in. At the same time, he acknowledged his legitimate right to secure a future for his family. Don Jose saw the goodness in this man, who, despite lacking formal academic training, displayed undeniable wisdom. Convinced that it was the best solution, he proposed drafting a new agreement in which Stephen would become the majority shareholder, while Don Jose continued to handle administrative affairs, ensuring the promises of literacy and personal development for Stephen and other workers. That plan seemed fair and beneficial to everyone. They scheduled a new meeting to iron out the technical details, but hinted there would be a symbolic ceremony to formalize the new property structure. Everyone realized that signing those documents, the second signing, would be as, or even more significant than the first. William, upon hearing the news, left without a word, his face drawn in frustration at finding himself sidelined. On the other hand, the press, learning of the possible resolution, began to portray Stephen as a local hero, the illiterate man who nonetheless possessed the wisdom to avert a labor disaster. As hours passed and the late afternoon light filtered through the conference room windows, Stephen recognized that his life would never be the same. That evening, he went home to the admiring looks of his family, and, although he felt overwhelmed, he also experienced deep relief. The humiliations of the past no longer hung over him, and the future now opened like a wide road full of possibilities. The official announcement that Stephen will become the project's majority shareholder shook the entire community. In the days that followed, rumors were confirmed definitively, and both the construction company and Don Jose released statements to the local press explaining that they would come to an arrangement with the legitimate heir of the land. The news triggered a wave of reactions. Some applauded the decision as a form of poetic justice, while others, more skeptical, feared that the humble bricklayer might be manipulated for the investors' benefit. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the atmosphere grew a bit unusual. Most workers were relieved that the project wouldn't be shut down and their jobs were safe. Nevertheless, they now looked at Stephen with a blend of respect and curiosity, as if he had suddenly become a figure set apart. Stephen noticed some co-workers were uneasy about greeting him, while others approached with suggestions and proposals that he, still overwhelmed, was unsure how to handle. Marta, the young architect, and Pedro, the experienced bricklayer, met with Stephen privately to offer any guidance they could. Since the deed signing incident, both had become his confidants and close friends. Marta explained that as a majority shareholder, Stephen would have a decisive vote in future board meetings, and Pedro reminded him that he'd need honest, capable people around him to avoid legal pitfalls. All of this was beyond anything Stephen had ever imagined. Until recently, his main concern had been measuring the right amount of cement. Over time, Don Jose convened a series of meetings with lawyers to draft a new partnership agreement. He also suggested that Stephen appoint someone he trusted to ensure transparency in all the terms. However, Stephen didn't have much experience or a network of professional contacts, so he asked Don Jose for an impartial referral. The investor, eager for a fair deal, yet still looking out for his own interests, offered the services of a reputable legal firm known for its integrity. In parallel, William continued to voice his displeasure in passive-aggressive ways. His conduct at the site was increasingly erratic, and although he retained his title as the project's engineer, Don Jose quietly started relieving him of certain responsibilities. Frustrated, William muttered that the whole situation was absurd and that someone who couldn't read had no business owning anything. But there was no legal recourse against the overwhelming evidence of Stephen's inheritance. As Stephen settled into his new role and endured endless meetings, he continued his literacy lessons as best he could, now feeling even more pressure to master reading and writing swiftly. Each new document seemed to be written in a foreign, complicated language. His volunteer teacher, moved by his determination, came up with fresh strategies to speed up his progress and spent extra hours reviewing lessons with him. Tensions peaked when the date was set to sign the contract that would make Stephen the project's majority shareholder. It was scheduled as a public event, attended by media outlets and some local authorities. The scale of the ceremony intimidated Stephen, but also drove him to overcome his limitations. At night, he poured himself into studying, often waking in the early morning with letters and numbers swirling in his head. On the day before the signing, Don Jose invited Stephen to lunch in a restaurant in town to discuss the agreement's final details. The investor explained that while he would continue providing capital and management, Stephen, in theory, would have the final say on major decisions because his share of the company would make him its principal owner. Although it sounded promising, Stephen couldn't help feeling insecure, worrying that he might become just a puppet for those more adept at running a business. Noticing his concern, Don Jose tried to reassure him, emphasizing that honesty and practical experience on the site were as valuable as academic credentials, and that over time, Stephen could complement his expertise with new knowledge. Yet Stephen couldn't shake the shadow cast by William. He wondered how the engineer would react upon seeing him sign an agreement of such magnitude. He was still hurt by the memory of William's taunts, knowing those wounds wouldn't vanish overnight. However, he also recognized that harboring resentment wouldn't help anyone, and that it was better to find a way to coexist professionally, so long as William was willing to show respect. That night, Stephen returned home feeling he was crossing the threshold into a completely new life. He found Elena, his wife, already making plans for the future, enrolling their son in a better school, fixing up their home, and helping her own mother pay off some old debts. In Elena's eyes, he saw the hope that he himself needed. He promised himself he would not be seduced by greed or arrogance, and that he would never forget his humble origins, a source of pride that had, in many ways, shaped who he was. That was the last night Stephen slept with the anxiety of an uncertain future. The following day, signing the contract would grant him a power he had never imagined, but also the greatest responsibilities of his life. Deep down, he felt that he would face more than just legal or financial issues. He would also be testing the values that had always defined him. Morning arrived on the day of the signing with clear skies and a cool breeze, as if heralding a new beginning. Early on, a small stage was set up at the construction site, adorned with flags and a sound system, so the legal representatives and the notary could witness the agreement. Several municipal officials attended, curious to see the event, and local media outlets wasted no time installing their cameras and microphones. Despite being a modest man, Stephen was about to formalize his majority stake in one of the region's most important construction projects. He arrived with his wife, Elena, and their son, who watched everything with child's enthusiasm. Don Jose, impeccably dressed, greeted him with a friendly smile and guided him to the table where the documents were waiting. Off to one side, the flags of the municipality and the company fluttered gently in the breeze, while dozens of workers gathered to witness the occasion. When the notary began reading the key clauses, Stephen felt a knot in his throat. Even though he had spent countless hours practicing his reading, the legal language was still quite daunting. Yet the notary, well aware of Stephen's situation, carefully paraphrased each section, and Don Jose occasionally chimed in to clarify some points for his new partner. The contract made it clear that Stephen would hold the majority of the shares, thanks to his legitimate inheritance of the land, while Don Jose would handle administration and contribute additional capital to see the construction through as planned. Murmurs rose among those present when it came time to sign. Everyone wanted to see how a once illiterate bricklayer would place his signature on such a major agreement. With a trembling hand, Stephen took the pen and, recalling his literacy lessons, carefully wrote his full name. His signature wasn't perfect, but it was legible and firm, an unmistakable sign that the humiliations were now behind him and that a new future awaited. Camera flashes illuminated the moment, freezing in the memories of everyone watching. Some co-workers applauded, cheering aloud because the act represented more than just a legal formality. It was a victory of dignity and the vindication of a man who had once been belittled. Don Jose signed next, sealing the pact that would change the lives of Stephen and all the families who depended on that construction site. For the media, the signing had an epic aura, like a story of triumph worthy of films and soap operas. They interviewed Stephen, who humbly spoke about the importance of never giving up and of always being willing to learn, regardless of age or social status. Though he still struggled to find the most eloquent words, his every phrase exuded honesty. When a journalist asked him what he felt about William's past insults, Stephen chose not to stir up controversy, simply expressing his hope that everyone could coexist respectfully because teamwork was key to a successful project. That statement left many onlookers astonished, especially William, who stood in a corner with furrowed brow. The once arrogant man felt deeply uncomfortable, even afraid, knowing that Stephen, now his superior, could retaliate if he chose to. However, Stephen showed no sign of resentment, which only magnified William's guilt and discomfort. After the signing, there was a small toast to celebrate the new partnership. Workers were pleased and got back to their tasks with renewed enthusiasm. Don Jose used the occasion to formally introduce Stephen as a partner and reiterate that the union of the company's expertise and Stephen's legitimate property rights would lead the project to maximum success and collective well-being. Later, when the cameras were turned off and the crowd thinned out, Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. His heart overflowed with pride, yet also uncertainty. He knew he had to honor the trust placed in him and, above all, prove that a man without formal schooling could responsibly handle such a crucial role. His new office was merely a temporary space, but to him, it represented uncharted territory and at the same time, a symbol of how far he had come. In the days that followed, the administrative duties piled up. He had to coordinate meetings, review budgets, and sign more documents. Reading still posed a challenge, but thanks to the intense literacy sessions and his colleagues' support, he managed to keep up. Marta, the architect, gave him technical advice. Pedro, the veteran bricklayer, helped him stay grounded, reminding him of the importance of high-quality workmanship and worker safety. Meanwhile, William found it increasingly difficult to maintain his position. It was clear that he no longer held moral authority in the eyes of the workers, who regarded him with suspicion. Several times he made sarcastic remarks about Stephen, but most people ignored him. A rumor circulated that he was looking for employment elsewhere, fearing he might be fired. Yet no one could dismiss him without just cause, and Stephen had no intention of seeking revenge. Despite the hardships William had caused him, the days stretched into weeks, and the site progressed smoothly. The structures took shape under Marta's leadership and William's technical supervision, while Stephen oversaw everything with Don Jose. The project seemed headed for success, and each brick laid represented everyone's collective effort. People working side by side, regardless of academic level, to create something extraordinary. Gradually, Stephen gained confidence in himself. He was surprised to realize that he could read entire paragraphs in the daily reports and detect inconsistencies in the budgets. His volunteer teacher often praised him for his rapid progress, saying it accomplished more in a few months than others might in years, driven by necessity and self-respect. Elena, his wife, was prouder than ever, and their son began to see Stephen as a role model of perseverance. As time went on, Stephen's growth as majority shareholder drew attention not just from local media, but also from the wider business community. People heard about a man who, without formal schooling and initially unable to read, was leading an expanding, successful construction project. This account of perseverance and determination piqued the interest of investors in other regions, who approached Don Jose to discuss possible collaborations. With those new opportunities, however, came new challenges. Stephen was increasingly immersed in management activities, attending meetings out of town and hosting business visitors at the site. He sensed, with some anxiety, that the frantic pace of negotiations and obligations left him with less time for literacy classes and his family. He did his best, though, never wanted to neglect any one aspect because he knew that at this point, every decision was critical. Meanwhile, on the site, workers received gradual improvements to their working conditions, wage increases, updated safety gear, and periodic training. The literacy program, which had initially been focused on Stephen, expanded to include everyone interested, even extending to workers' families. The construction site had become a symbol not just of economic progress, but of human growth. As for William, he faced a crossroads. Though his ego wouldn't allow him to publicly admit it, he couldn't deny that Stephen's leadership had breathed new life into the project. He noticed that communication flowed better, and the workers seemed more committed. However, it was still hard for him to accept that someone he'd once belittled could rise to such a position of authority. His sarcastic comments popped up now and then, but carried less weight each time. Then one day, at roughly the halfway point of the project's final phase, something unforeseen happened. A government inspector from the Urban Development Commission found irregularities in the site's technical documentation. According to the report, there were missing signatures from certain responsible parties, as well as discrepancies between the official blueprints and the actual construction. This threatened the possibility of sanctions and even a temporary shutdown of work, news that hit the management team like a bucket of cold water. Stephen, knowing the project could not afford a significant delay, called an emergency meeting with Don Jose, Marta, and William to examine the matter. They discovered that the main problem lay in certain municipal permits William had handled less than rigorously. The requirements demanded a set of updated blueprints and a detailed inventory of materials and safety measures, none of which had been completed in full. Both Stephen and Don Jose worked to keep everyone calm and map out a strategy to correct the errors. William, however, became defensive, insisting it was a shared responsibility and that it acted under pressure to speed the project along. The tension almost escalated into a major argument, but Marta's presence and Stephen's measured approach helped contain it. They decided to redo the blueprints urgently and provide the city with the missing documents as soon as possible. Everyone pitched in around the clock. Marta and her team worked on the new plans, adjusting each section to reflect what was actually built. Meanwhile, Stephen assisted with administrative tasks, carefully reviewing each document. Even more impressive considering his previous struggles with reading. His hands-on knowledge of construction was invaluable in correcting overlooked details. William, meanwhile, was subdued yet cooperative, recognizing that his own reputation was at stake. Night after night became extended work sessions, and Stephen hardly saw his family. Elena understood the seriousness of the situation, sending him supportive messages and keeping a warm meal for him when he finally got home late at night. Several workers stayed behind to help compile data and transcribe reports, aware that if they didn't solve this issue, the site might be shut down, jeopardizing everyone's livelihood. After a week of intense effort, the team gathered all the required documentation to rectify the inspector's findings. They scheduled an appointment at the municipal office to submit everything and stave off sanctions. Stephen, heart-pounding, went there with Don Jose and William, prepared to defend the project and explain that these had been honest mistakes that were now resolved. Thankfully, the authorities recognized their quick response and willingness to cooperate, granting them an extension to finalize inspections and avoid a shutdown. It was a hard lesson and left its mark on Stephen and everyone else on the management team. They realized that a project's success depends not only on good intentions and a spirit of self-improvement, but also on strict adherence to procedures and regulations. Marta, relieved, admitted she had feared a much worse outcome. And in an unexpected show of humility, William apologized to both Stephen and Don Jose for the oversight in permit handling. Stephen, rather than using the moment to shame him, graciously accepted his apology and proposed working together to ensure it never happened again. This ordeal strengthened Stephen's leadership and proved that, despite his initial limitations, he had gained the ability to face adversity with calm resolve. The workers thought highly of him, seeing in him a leader who didn't hide problems but confronted and solved them as a team. Many began to realize that the mockery Stephen had once endured for not knowing how to read was wholly unjust, as it was clear his intelligence and ability went far beyond basic literacy. As the construction neared completion, the environment was marked by unity and optimism. Though some technical challenges remained, the project now advanced smoothly, free of legal or administrative hurdles. Crews worked diligently, envisioning the towers that would soon be sold or leased, benefiting both the company and the wider community. Walking through the newly built hallways and spacious rooms, soon to become offices and homes, Stephen felt indescribable excitement, recalling his early days as a humble bricklayer mocked for his illiteracy. At the partial inauguration of the first building, an event was held attended by government representatives, investors, and some media outlets. Visitors toured the facilities, inspected the safety procedures, and heard about the project's social impact, including the literacy efforts that had benefited several workers. Stephen, now the majority shareholder, gave a brief speech. Though nervous, he spoke with a voice full of gratitude and hope, thanking everyone who believed in him and reminding all that true growth is measured not only in infrastructure, but also in the opportunities created for the people. William, who was there, maintained a low profile, and some people noted that his usual arrogance was gone. The celebration ended on a cheerful note, and it seemed as if all grudges were consigned to the past, replaced by genuine collaboration. Don Jose told reporters that the project had been a learning experience for him as well, demonstrating the importance of recognizing people's potential beyond their academic degrees or outward appearances. Stephen, meanwhile, kept attending his literacy classes whenever he could, though less often than he would have liked. He wasn't seeking to become a scholar, just to gain enough reading and writing skills to work independently on contracts, reports, and any other document that might give him more freedom. He still struggled at times, but each step forward reminded him that persistence and self-confidence pay off. With the project's first phase nearly finished, people wondered what might come next. Rumor had it that Don Jose planned to expand into other parts of the city, and that if all went well, Stephen would play an even more prominent role in future developments. The community started viewing him as a kind of standard-bearer, a man who had given a voice to construction workers and proven, without humiliating anyone, that positive change was possible for everyone. Local media outlets stayed interested in his story, approaching him for interviews and features. Stephen, though weary of the public attention, realized that sharing his experience could inspire others who, like him, had been pushed aside or underestimated. So whenever he had the chance, he emphasized that the key was persistence and teamwork, not resentment or revenge. His message resonated especially with young people in the area, who began believing that hard, honest work and determination could open doors once thought impossible. As the buildings were completed and the first families moved into their new homes, Stephen felt his own house, the one he had built years ago with his own hands, gain a new life. With his current earnings, he was able to make improvements, adding better finishes and buying some furniture. Yet he refused to drastically change his lifestyle because he believed that simplicity was an essential part of who he was. His family shared this mindset, living with the conviction that true wealth isn't measured solely in material goods. Fate, however, had more surprises in store for Stephen. A few months after the inauguration, it emerged that an international group of investors was interested in purchasing part of the project to expand it with shopping malls and recreational spaces. This move would require even more complex negotiations, and Stephen's role as majority shareholder would be pivotal in determining the direction of such a large investment. Taking his responsibilities seriously, he decided to assemble a larger team of technical and legal advisors, setting the condition that all the site's original workers keep their jobs and that the training and personal development initiatives he cherished remain in place. In the end, the community watched a simple bricklayer, now dressed a bit more formally, sitting at a table with foreign executives, scrutinizing their proposals and demanding clear explanations for each clause. He still sometimes stumbled over words when reading parts of the contract, but he relied on his team and refused to sign anything without fully understanding it. Some called it a miracle, others chalked it up to luck. But those who really knew Stephen recognized a noble heart and unwavering determination of a man who never gave up on himself. And so, the man who had once been humiliated for not knowing how to read ended up becoming the rightful owner of a project that changed many people's lives. With every brick, every wall, and every signature he penned, the lesson remained clear. A person's worth is not measured by their limitations, but by their willpower to rise above them. In the end, what people discovered during that deed signing wasn't just the true identity of an heir, but the transformative power of perseverance, humility, and teamwork. If this story inspired you, please leave a comment and share this video so that more people can discover the power of believing in themselves and one another. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.